With housekeeping done, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Temple Micah's Education Director, Sharon Tash. Sharon has taught Holocaust history in formal and informal settings, as well as to some of the opening team at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for over 38 years. In that time, the field of Holocaust education has developed and changed. As we consider how we will teach this topic in years to come without the participation of Holocaust survivors, many new factors have come into play, and this has been on Sharon's mind as she thinks about the curriculum here at Mahone Micah. Sharon and her husband, Nathan, are both native to DC, and their families have lived for 100 years in the DC area. In her free time, Sharon pursues the seemingly incongruous hobby of learning every possible detail about the history of Disney parks and then visiting them whenever possible. An avid film buff, Sharon also has had a short stint as an education specialist at AFI Silver before joining our team here at Temple Micah. Sharon and Nathan have 3 wonderful grown children, Julian, Mira, and Jonah. With a last reminder to keep muted and post your questions to Zoom chat, I'm delighted to turn over the floor to Sharon Tash.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to Lunch and Learn. I want to open by saying I was disappointed to know that we're going to be doing this online, because I know what a great lunch you provide in person. So I'll have to come back and when we get going again. But it is my pleasure to be here. And when I was thinking about what I might talk about, I actually envisioned this more as a discussion rather than a presentation, because this is something that it's been on my mind. Through the many years I've been teaching about the Holocaust, and this field is changing a lot. And I thought I would open by telling you a brief story about what's an anecdote. In August 1980, I was about to become a high school senior, and I co-chaired our youth group summer encampment down in North Carolina. And as part of that program, we one night, all the kids were woken up at about 1 o'clock in the morning and hurried and rushed into the auditorium, where they were met with complete silence, and all the staff was very, very harsh and very punitive, made them sit down, and they just turned on the movie Night and Fog, which you may be familiar with. And these are kids like 9th grade through 12th graders. And we watched the movie in silence in the middle of the night in our pajamas. And then they turned on the lights and had a discussion. But if you're familiar with that film, you know that it's an extremely graphic, it has many graphic scenes and depictions, which were probably completely inappropriate for children. And it really scared the heck out of most of the kids. And it was a disturbing and disconcerting event. And when I think back on it, I think, what were they thinking? Because when we teach the Holocaust now, we're very careful with the way we introduce it and with the type of images that we talk about with children. And that was 1980. Through the many years to follow, Holocaust education has actually become a field of study and a field of practice. But one of the centerpieces of that, starting around that time, I would say starting in the late 70s until a few years ago, was bringing Holocaust survivors to speak to school children, because that's such an immediate and effective way for, if they meet someone who went through their own experience. It's, of course, each experience is a separate experience, but it's so meaningful. And the kids will go home and say, oh, I met someone who lived through who survived the Holocaust, and we hear their stories, etc. That is almost no longer possible. So as we consider how we're going to teach it in the future, I think there's so many organizations and there's so much media. This was the most documented atrocity, in in the 20th century, probably. There's the number of documents and photographs and film. And then, of course, there have been books and Hollywood films and all of the subsequent things that have come along, that there's a lot of material that we have that we can use. Nevertheless, probably one of the most immediate things is to meet a survivor. So I had the opportunity, I studied Jewish history in college and graduate school, and I had the opportunity to work on the startup team at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And the project that I was hired to work on was actually the ID card project. If you have visited the museum, at the very beginning, you receive an ID card. And the way we researched those cards and got that information was largely to meet with survivors and interview them and learn about them, their story, and their family story. So that's how we have the story of those who perished. Using those interviews as well as transcripts of other interviews that had been conducted by the museum, we created the ID cards. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I will introduce you to a couple of people that I met through the ID card project. And then what I'd like to do is to show some of the efforts that have been undertaken to try to make the Holocaust education immediate and relevant for students of today and of the future. And I really, as I said, I envisioned this as a discussion so we can talk about some of these modalities that are being introduced. And there's some really interesting and creative projects out there. So I will just start sharing and we can take a look together. Sorry. This is where I fall down, it's the technology part. Okay. All righty, can you see that?
Yeah, could you make it full screen?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, that is not the one I wanted to start with. Okay, so here we go. These are 4 survivors with whom I worked closely at various times. One, Selma Engel. She was a Dutch Jew who, she and her husband Chaim survived the uprising at the Sobibor death camp. You may have, there was a depiction, there was a television show, Escape from Sobibor. They were, their story was represented in that film, and she was just an amazing, amazing person. She's featured in the film that's at the very end of the exhibition, the permanent exhibition at the Holocaust Museum, and just a remarkable person. And she dedicated her life to speaking with school children. And I actually had her as a guest at my classroom at one point. They lived in Connecticut, but they were visiting this area, and they came and we had them come and tell their story. And it was absolutely riveting. And I think there's just nothing that can sort of replace that. Sorry, very sensitive screen. Another lady that I got to know is Lisa Fischer. She was a German Jew who was sent on the Kindertransport after Kristallnacht, which, as you might know, that yesterday and today are the 83rd anniversary, actually, of the Kristallnacht pogrom. So that's it's kind of meaningful that we're doing it today. I know it's random that we are here together today, but so she was sent away. She was from the city of Augsburg in Germany. She and her brother were sent to England, where they were put into sort of servitude with a very wealthy Jewish family. And unfortunately, her brother died while they were there because he got sick and they didn't get him medical attention. So she had a very, very hard life and a hard story, but she met regularly with kids and just an amazing person. Then the next person I want to introduce you to, his name is Konrad Rode. He is also a Dutch Jew, and he wrote a report It's about 500 pages long, and it's in the archives of the Holocaust Museum. We tried to get it published as a book, but the publishers told him they wanted some more like love scenes. And he said, this is a report of what actually I went through, and I'm not going to add love scenes. So it never got published in English. I believe at a certain point it's been published in German. But here he talks about, in this interview with the Shoah Foundation, and I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes also more about the Shoah Foundation, about his attitude of how to live your life. So I'm just gonna, this is like a 1-minute clip. Oh, and it didn't work. There we go.
We should try to understand each other.
Can you hear it?
We should try to live with each other, accommodate each other as much as we can.
You might make it a little louder.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Don't be
Or
bossy.
people at home can make their volume, turn their
I'm so
volume up.
sorry. I can't.
And if somebody
Oh, let's see.
to you, listen.
Our
But if you
volume
don't
can't
believe
come
what
high
I say,
enough to
don't
hear
be
it.
afraid to say so.
Why don't you start it over, Sharon? It might be better.
Sure. Sorry about that.
And then I know you have
Okay, sorry, and I'm not succeeding.
We should try to understand each other. We should try to live with each other, accommodate each other as much as we can. Don't be a boss. Don't be bossy. And especially don't hurt each other. And if somebody speak to you, listen. But if you don't believe what they're saying, don't be afraid to say so. I do. I do it on my customers. We should try to understand each other. We should try to live with each other, accommodate each other as much as we can. Don't be a boss. Don't be bossy. And especially don't hurt each other. And if somebody speak to you, listen. But if you don't believe what they're saying, don't be afraid to say so. I do. I do it on my customers.
And then I know you have been speaking out for a long time about your experiences,
Yes.
and now again here for the Shoah Foundation. Is there a special message you would like to pass on to future generations?
At the end of my presentation for children, I always say, don't hate. Don't ever hate each other. It starts by hating. Try to understand each other. And if you cannot love each other, at least respect each other.
Okay, so I have been struck so many times by when I meet the survivors and they tell me about what they talk about with kids, that their message of tolerance is remarkable after the things that they went through and lived through. If I'm not mistaken, he was in about 15 different work camps. And he's a remarkable person. He was trained as a young man as a baker. And then later in life, he became a tailor, a master tailor. And he had a tailor shop until he passed away, and was very, very active in Holocaust education. He settled in northern Texas and spoke all over the place to schools that had very, probably no Jewish children. So, he was a real character. He was an amazingly, a vortex of energy to meet him. And so I think when kids met him, he left a great impression. And finally, just in terms of the last survivor I'll mention, and you may have met her, she lives here in Silver Spring, Nessie Godin. She's an amazing, amazing speaker. She was a very young girl from maybe Lithuania. I think she was from Lithuania. And she dedicated her entire life. She was one of the people who spoke early on, like in the 70s, when a lot of survivors were not ready to come forward and share their story. She started doing this, and it became her mission and she is still alive today. I don't know if she's doing as much speaking as she used to, but she is very sought after and very effective because she knows exactly what to say to the kids. So I have another, this is just sort of talking about the field of Holocaust education and how people started putting in so much energy. In the early 1990s, they started realizing that the survivors were aging and that there might not be the opportunity to interview them. And in particular, Steven Spielberg, after making the film Schindler's List, dedicated huge resources and created the Shoah Foundation, which is housed at USC in California. And they created this visual history archive. And they just started interviewing people. They trained people all over, I think all over the world, actually, but certainly all over North America. They have about 55,000 testimonies in the archive, and more than 4,000 of these are available immediately online. Like you can just go on, and I'll show you even how to do it if you're interested. Before we get to the USC, I'd like to also mention another organization which is trying to digitize tens of thousands of photographs, called Centropa. It's based in Vienna, Austria. And it sort of it's a brainchild of a photojournalist named Edward Serrata, who sort of accidentally formed this organization. And it turned into an education organization. They go around to schools, they bring teachers from kind of all over the world, from especially Central and Eastern Europe, and they talk to them about content. They have interviewed thousands of people, or yeah, I would say at this point, thousands of people. They've created films, an amazing archive of films using the photographs. It's not mostly filmed interviews, it just tells the story using the photographs that they have digitized. And it's very, very beautifully done. And they're short, generally, 7 minutes, 5 minutes. They talk about the Sephardic experience. They do this survival in Sarajevo. Actually talks about a contemporary, the issue in Bosnia in the early 90s. And it compares some of the things, and it talks about how the Jewish community partnered with Muslims and Christians to help other people. And so there's the whole aspect of tolerance and everything else. So Centropa is one of the interesting, not specifically Holocaust, but certainly related to the Holocaust kind of organization that's out there trying to do Holocaust education. And then we have Echoes and Reflections, which is just this vast resource that I think they've only touched the tip of the iceberg from the Shoah Foundation. But I just pulled up a couple of things just to give you an example of what is out there available to teachers if just absolutely anything to do with the Holocaust. Here's the topic of survivors and liberators, talking about teaching the unit. They have teaching objectives, they have video links, they have academic standards these are for public school teachers who are, need to meet certain standards of their curriculum. Testimony, they have cataloged the clips of Holocaust survivors based on topic. So you can find a short clip that pertains to what you might want to teach. And it's like so vast, and to even have an estimated completion time. So if you want a 1 hour lesson, if you want 5 1-hour lessons, you can go into this and take whatever you like and adapt it. And that they've made it very, very flexible. They also offer free online teacher trainings. And all you have to do is sign up. Sometimes when you sign up, they send you a hard copy of this curriculum guide that they've created. And like I said, there's a lot more potential for to use the materials that they have created. So there's also Yad Vashem. If we go on to Yad Vashem, which is of course the Holocaust Institute in Israel, based in Jerusalem, and they call themselves the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. So their perspective is a little bit different. If you have visited Yad Vashem, you're struck immediately by the emphasis is on Jewish life before the war, and then into the experience and remembrance. So there's a lot of the children's memorial in Yad Vashem and the whole wall of photos, but they also have amazing educational materials all available online here. They've connected with Echoes and Reflections. They have videos, they have seminars for teachers, again, highly funded. Most of them are almost completely free for if teachers want to go to Jerusalem and spend a week or 10 days there to learn about Holocaust education. They have cataloged their survivor testimonies. And these are just lessons that you can click on. This is a beautiful one, the Holocaust in the Arts. Talk about poetry, and there's art with it, and it's just great. So, people who are teaching a literature class can incorporate some of this. You can incorporate it into a history class, et cetera, and ethics, anything like that. Everybody is trying to take what has been collected and make it relevant for today's students. Now we also have, of course, our local institution, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, has a huge education site. They ask you to fill it out and they can be in touch with you. They have teacher seminars. They have lots of online teaching resources with lesson plans created by teachers who have come to their seminars. They also have the topics. They have, for example, the ID cards that I talked about, the ones that I worked on, are now available online, as are the films that are at the beginning of the exhibition. At one point, I think originally there was no intention of making those films available, but I think they changed their thrust and the demand for this this kind of material, and it's all online. You can use it in your classroom. You can request materials, and I mean it goes on and on and on. It's absolutely endless. In fact, it's overwhelming. Another way that people are trying to find a way into the story is using art to tell survivor stories. I attended an online webinar this summer by this woman, Mona Golubek, is a concert pianist, and her mother was also a concert pianist who was sent on the Kindertransport, and she has created this whole foundation called Hold On to Your Music, and she's created a performance about her mother where she becomes her mother, and she uses music during the presentation, telling the story and acting it out, and it's absolutely beautiful. And she's also written books. There's a book, like a young adult version called The Children of Williston Lane, but there's also a new children's picture book, which I think is called Hold On to Your Music. So it's another way into the story. It's really, really beautiful and really accessible. It's almost overwhelming, the amount of stuff that's available. Here's another one. This came to my attention a couple of years ago. The museum, it's in Baltimore. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but this exhibition, Esther Krinitz, was a woman who was a quilter, and she was a survivor. She told her story by creating this series of quilts where she talked about her entire experience in the Holocaust by quilting her story, which is, amazing. There's a short film, 30-minute film called Through the Eye of the Needle. This is all available online. I can send you a list, by the way, of these links if you're interested in looking at any of it. But this is a place where it was, the American Visionary Art Museum. I'm so sorry, I forgot the name. We brought our sixth graders there in February 2020. I'm so happy that we booked it at that time because no one knew that we wouldn't be able to go anywhere for the next at least 2 years. So And they got to see these quilts and learn about Esther and her life. And this project is a project that her daughters created to turn it into an exhibition. She had just quilted it as almost like a catharsis to tell her story, to use it to tell her story. So that's just another beautiful way that they can relate to it. Now I have what I sort of think is the centerpiece of this discussion, and what I would like to show you. You may have heard about this. It is a hologram project. Actually, the Shoah Foundation also has a hologram project where they endeavored to record hundreds and hundreds of hours of particular survivors. And then it's a presentation. Kids or adults come into an auditorium and they interact with this hologram of the survivor. And I'd like to show you this. It's a few minutes long. It's probably up to 8 minutes. Maybe we won't watch the whole thing, but it's very, very interesting. And it is meant as a means to actually, quote unquote, meet a survivor. So let's take a look at this.
What happens when the last Holocaust survivor dies? Who will tell their story? And is there a way to be remembered forever?
Do you think you were brave during the Holocaust?
I don't look at it that way. I look at it as maybe being selfish because I wanted to live while everybody else around me was dying, was being killed.
The Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Chicago found a way to permanently preserve survivor stories in the world's first 3D interactive hologram exhibition. Much like Siri or Alexa, you can ask the hologram questions.
What is your message to us?
Young people who don't know what they're going to do with their life, my job is to insist, to instill in them that they have the ability to overcome all types of adversity if they believe in themselves and if they're willing to pay the price.
Aaron Elster was 10 when he survived the Holocaust in Poland. He escaped the ghetto and hid for almost 2 years in the attic of a Polish family. A woman named Mrs. Gorski fed him soup and a slice of bread once a day. He didn't step out of the attic until the end of World War II.
Life, thousands of lives have finally died. The inability to wash, to brush your teeth, to change your clothes, to cut your hair. It's all those things. It was a very miserable, painful existence.
The idea came about because we had been grappling with how we tell Holocaust survivor stories in an engaging way for generations to come. And we came across the USC Shoah Foundation in California, who had a pilot program where they had recorded a Holocaust survivor over multiple days.
What was life like before the war?
I had a very happy childhood.
And then used a custom natural voice recognition software to allow people to ask the recording a question and have the recording answer.
How does this work?
Sure. So what you're seeing, which looks three-dimensional to us standing here, is what's actually called a Pepper's Ghost. And what it relies on is a screen on the bottom, which we have an LED screen on the floor, and then what we call a foil that's kind of a angled plastic. And the projection that is coming from the floor bounces up and then it projects in a three-dimensional way.
And they all come to Los Angeles for about a week, and they sit under a dome of light surrounded by cameras, more than 100 cameras. We go through the process of asking them 1,500 or so questions. It takes several days. It's very tiring, especially when you're older and you're sitting in front of lights and answering difficult questions about your life. The answers are recorded. When we asked the question under the dome, they started speaking. They kept talking until they were finished, and we don't edit anything in between. Authenticity is really important to us. It wasn't only about the technology. I mean, for us, it's all about telling stories.
What happened to your little sister, Sarah?
When my poor little sister died.
Okay, I'll actually stop it there, but I think you get the idea at this point of what that project is trying to achieve. And I guess the things that I've read about it is that, they see it as like the next best thing to actually being able to meet a survivor. If you go onto the USC site, you can see the one that they refer to in this video. And you can actually type into a chat. You can type your question and the person answers that question as well. So it's not just asking voice questions. You can type it in as well using their technology. One other project that came to my attention
What happens when the last
recently
Holocaust survivor dies?
Is using social media. This is sort of a controversial one. Also, a guy in Israel named Mati Kochavi and his daughter decided that they would create something called the Ava Stories. And they launched it on Instagram. And they did it with using their own private funding because they were afraid that it would meet with resistance from historians and everything else. But I just want to show you what it looks like. It's like they've created an Instagram posting by a supposed young teen from the 1930s. So here's the, we don't want that, but this is what it looks like.
Hi, my name's Eva. Welcome to my page. Follow me. This is my page for random thoughts, crushes, my hashtag BFFs. One day, I'll be a famous reporter. But for now, I live with my grandparents.
Now you make a wish?
Dirty Jew.
Hitler conquered us. Like that. We have to go back immediately. Jews can no longer own businesses.
From today, I must document everything that happens to us.
So that's something where they're trying to use today's technology so children will relate to it as an actual story. I would love for us to talk about that in the breakout groups, what you think of this idea. It's certainly creative and something different. I had not seen anything like this before. Another thing that recently I learned about, let me, if I can change the slide. It doesn't want to change. Okay, is something called the Courtroom 600 project. This is a much more conventional way of going about it, but it's got mobile-friendly resources, videos, podcasts, photos, and documents, all relating to the legacy of the Nuremberg trials. And it's an immense. There's photo analysis, there's a visual tour. It talks about the Nuremberg trials. It shows they were filmed. So it shows the various trials that took place, and it gives all kinds of opportunities for students to debate the morality, and it also gives the background. And again, like as a teacher, there are so many materials available that the question is to weed out what you want to. I'm actually going to stop sharing for a minute, but to weed out the amount of things and decide what do you want to do with this, because there's just too much almost. And it still begs the question, none of these are actually meeting with a survivor. With, if you spend an hour with a Holocaust survivor and have them talk to you directly, is that ultimately the best way to have children relate to this? I know that in today's curriculum planning, that public schools for a while had small sliver of Holocaust education. Sometimes they would work it into their English department where they would read the Diary of Anne Frank or something like that, or one of the ones that's geared towards younger children, like Number the Stars. Now I think that those are slowly getting pushed out, and it's not, in public schools at least. And I've got to tell you, even in Jewish schools, I've been teaching, since basically 1980 in Hebrew school. And whereas it was a given that we would cover it through the 80s and the 90s, now we get pushback from parents saying they don't want their children introduced to this topic. They don't want us to decide when it's time to teach them this topic. They want to be the ones to discuss it with them and in what ways. So, there's that. We have less instructional time than we ever have in Jewish educational settings because we compete with a lot of extracurricular activities. And I think we are, at least if we're not on par in terms of importance with some of them, we are below below the importance of some of the team sports and things like that, because those are very demanding on the children's time. So we have to decide how much of this we're going to introduce as well. So it's really a huge question. And how can we do this without Holocaust survivors? So really my goal today was to bring some of these endeavors to your attention in case you hadn't heard about them, and show you what so many people are working so hard to preserve this history and to try to make it immediate and relevant for today's children. And I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen with this field and how it's going to work, and if these technologies are ultimately going to be successful. And I created a few questions for the breakout groups that talk really about the use of these technologies, like using the Instagram, using the Hologram project, because I've got the thing that came to my mind when I learned about the hologram and then watched that little video clip was, my husband and I took our kids to the Universal Studios Harry Potter world, and you go into the Hogwarts castle and you see holograms of Harry and Hermione and Ron, and it looks like they're standing right in front of you, but they're not real people, and it's not really them. There's no one standing there. It's a film. How easy would it be to deny the Holocaust and say that isn't a real person? That's an actor. He's up there, and he's, how do I know that that's real? So I think that opens the door to some questions. And of course, today with deep fake technology and all of those things, I fear that it could be that, something as important as this project might just become another one of those sort of faddish kind of things. So that's really all that I just wanted to show you, all these different examples of projects that are going on. They're educational endeavors. They're huge. They're trying to appeal to teachers and make free material. Most of these are completely open source, available on the internet. You can go on and click on it and take a look at any of it. And it's phenomenal, but it is also overwhelming. So I haven't looked at the chat box because I've been talking this whole time. So
Sharon, don't worry about it, because we have an MC who will direct questions toward you.
Okay.
So Sid, if you want to unmute yourself.
Wait, David, can I just introduce?
Oh, you have to say, yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
First of all, I want to thank Sharon for your excellent presentation. And I know you've compiled a list of references that we will send out to all the participants today. And the questions that you left us with, which will be typed into the chat box, are: it seems to me there are numerous ethical questions raised in particular by the Hologram project. In what way will that be perceived as another virtual reality scenario? Will it be easier to say this is all a deep fake? Does the Instagram Ava Stories project flatten the reality of Ava Hyman's story and make it into a shallow, kitschy entertainment? What is the right balance that educators must strike in order to convey the messages that one survivor testimony could achieve? Can you envision other new ways for the field of Holocaust education to make these stories immediate for today's learners? If you have a question for Sharon, please post it in the chat addressed to everyone. I know we have about 10 questions already. And now I'd like to introduce Sid Booth, our moderator for the question and answer period. Okay, Sid.
Thank you. And Sharon, thank you very much. You must feel, as I do right now, as if I'm on the wrong end of a fire hose. This vast, wonderfully creative volume of choices and opportunities for education. I think it would help us. Many in the group here are several generations away from what we would have called cheder ourselves. And would you just give us a quick snapshot of Mahone, how many, where your teachers come from, just a minute or so, and at what point you think it's appropriate to introduce the Holocaust?
Absolutely, yes. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this year we have the highest enrollment that Mahone Micah has ever had. We have 201 kindergarten through 7th graders. And we have 19 teens working as madrichim on Sunday mornings. And we also have right now about 15 teens in our R2B high school program. And that's growing weekly. So we're hoping to actually grow that a little bit more. So we probably like 240 to 250. And that's like 100 kids more than we had 2 years ago. So it's huge.
It's stunning. And at what point do you find you want to introduce the Holocaust?
Okay, that's a great question. We have actually decided that we introduce it actually starting in 3rd grade during Yom HaShoah. We have some very age-appropriate lessons. There are some really great children's books that have come out. And they do it in an indirect way, clearly. And so starting in 3rd grade, we at least touch upon it. We do not have a systematic Holocaust curriculum at the moment. We have taught it in our high school, and we raise it certainly with like 5th through 7th grade during the course of the year. But I do not have at the moment dedicated like blocks of time dedicated to Holocaust education, and it kills me because like Jewish history is my thing, but our kids are not even familiar with basic Torah stories. So we've had to pick and choose. We've been focusing on Torah, holidays, Israel, a little bit of Jewish history as it comes up. So that's.
And how many teachers do we have?
Oh, we have a lot of teachers. I have, I think 23 teachers on Sunday mornings. I have 7 teachers, 23 teachers plus 19 madrichim on Sunday mornings, and 7 Tuesday afternoon teachers, and and we also have specialists. We have an Israeli dancing specialist. We have someone doing yoga, Jewish yoga with the kids. We have a music specialist. So that's more like 25 or 26 teachers.
All right, so let's get to the topic. First question out of the box from Francie. In 1995, I studied for a month at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. One of the controversies revolved around the extent to universalize the teaching of the Shoah. How do you feel about this?
I feel very strongly that that we can still emphasize the particular. I think that the question of the universal versus the particular, I always, as a student of Jewish history, I don't think it's a bad thing to point out the way that Jews were targeted, the way that the nature of anti-Semitism. I think we're seeing it today. It's bubbling, and not just bubbling, it's out there. It's overtly out there. And I think it's essential to keep the Jewish character of this. And when I worked at the Holocaust Museum, there was a lot of discussion about this. And, they have sort of positioned themselves as a place that that hosts events that talk about contemporary atrocities, contemporary genocides, and they make the connection. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it was founded also, the Holocaust Commission was pushed through by Jewish Holocaust survivors and Elie Wiesel in this country. So I feel strongly that it should not be completely universalized. I fear that as things continue, and certainly with the way that politics are nowadays, that it may become, let's say, watered down or de-Judaized in order to make it more palatable. And that hurts me. So does that answer your question?
We'll see. John, yes, John Hirschman, do you think current discussion about critical race theory will impact ability to teach about Shoah, the ability to teach about challenging subjects?
I think ultimately it will. I think that since that's so hot right now, I think it remains to be seen how it's all going to fall out and how we're going to be able to teach about it. But I think that sort of connects to what I was saying before, that I think that looking at something from I think it's okay to take it from a perspective of Jewish history, but we sort of have to apologize for that nowadays, which is problematic, I guess. And so I don't know entirely how all that's going to land, because it's still being discussed. So that's what I would say.
Of course, Karen Rosenbaum asks, or states, of course, there are many books, films, and conventional media that depict the Holocaust. How do these new media efforts differ in effect?
That's a great question. That's what I wanted to ask. I just wanted to sort of throw all this out there and show you all of it. I don't know, because my fear is that, everybody wants to be, we were talking about this at Temple Micah, like what should our presence on social media be? Because social media keeps changing. The one that everyone uses keeps changing. Like Facebook's only for old people now. And TikTok is what the kids are using, and they're no longer using Instagram. So this Instagram piece that I showed you, the kids have already migrated off of Instagram. So it won't be considered relevant. So I think like conventional media, like films and books and things like that are going to, may have more staying power ultimately. And if they're well done, they're like, I don't know if anyone here saw a couple of years ago, the film Joji Rabbit, which was exceptional. It was amazing. And my husband didn't even want to go see it with me because he thought it was going to be offensive. And it's remarkable. And I got the book on which it is based. It's very, very different. The Taika Waititi, the director, took this vision of his and made it into something amazing. So when you have a piece of art like that really will resonate with kids. And by the way, we did a program with our seventh graders a couple of years ago, but before the pandemic ruined everything, and hopefully we'll get back to in-person things. But yeah, I think ultimately that the more mainstream things may have longer staying power, but that these educational projects that are, like the Hologram project and things, they have a very specific goal of making it immediate for people. So,
well, this might be a good segue to David Diskin's question. Which of these sites and social media efforts have you found most useful?
good question. I haven't tried using the latest one, the Instagram style ones. I use Centropa in my teaching. I became involved with Centropa about 11 years ago, and they do some really cool and different stuff by introducing educators to one another. I went to Europe with them twice, and they take you on tours of the places that are depicted in their films and with the survivors that they have worked with. And I called it like summer camp for teachers, because we had people from 17 countries. There were 3 or 4 busfuls of us traveling. It's a traveling educational trip, a 10-day trip that's highly funded. We were hosted by people in embassies all over the place, in Sarajevo and in Vienna, and just amazing. So I like their materials because they're a little bit different. So that's one that I really like. Echoes and Reflections is amazing. The way they have categorized the interviews. Like if you want an interview about, I don't know, Kristallnacht, someone who lived in, Vienna on Kristallnacht, you can just, sort of pull it up and integrate that into your lesson. It's very, very flexible. So.
Interesting. A lot of questions coming from teachers here. Helen Granoff asks, Sharon, are you familiar with the group Next Generations, where Holocaust survivors speak?
Yes, I am, and I know that all these groups are slowly, losing this. It's so hard and taxing for the survivors to tell their story because they basically relive it. Every time I've seen them tell their story, it's so emotional, and it just, it takes it out of them. And as they're going, even the people who are very young at the time are in their 90s now. So it's just hard. One thing that I noticed that I'll just mention is that when I was interviewing survivors in the early 90s, when I worked at the Holocaust Museum, I met with a large number of people who had never told their story, and their versions were so much more raw, unfiltered, and sort of unedited. Whereas the ones who go and speak regularly to groups, they sort of have their version of it. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I think that's actually good and useful. But when I was talking to them, we're trying to pull out details that they don't necessarily include in their regular talk. I had to go back and ask them for it. So the people who hadn't spoken before told, all kinds of things that just sort of like popped into their head about their story, and they hadn't told it before. And they weren't working off notes or anything like that. I mean, sometimes these interviews will last 6 hours long. And so it's just interesting to see how, how those stories are told. And ultimately, when we used the material in the ID card project, we had to distill it and choose what things we were going to include. And it was a very, very big responsibility because we're taking the piece of their story that we felt was going to be the most compelling to someone reading it on that tiny little card. So in fact, there was an article in, maybe it was in the Atlantic or Harper's, right when the museum opened, by a journalist named Philip Gorovich. And he talked about the ID cards. He talked about his visit to the museum, and that after he left, he's walked like down the street, maybe on Independence Avenue, and saw ID cards in the trash can, and what that was like, that was interesting, that, here you've gone through this thing and gone through their experience and lived it with them, and then it's in the trash can. So anyway, these are big asides. This has nothing to do with what I just brought to you.
Well, I think your comment about the experience of first time with a survivor helps all of us understand the extraordinary amount of work that's needed to pull the story into a coherent message. And thank you for that. Barbara Diskin wonders, I worry about the many other instances of genocide, Rwanda, Ethiopia, China, etc., that are not being so well documented. Kids need to understand that no genocide is acceptable.
Agreed. And here's a case where I think that this particular can be used to juxtapose. You can say, here's what happened in the 1930s and 40s, and no one learned anything, and it's still going on. And here's something that, so I think that's perfectly acceptable to do that too. And that's a way to raise awareness about these other genocides.
From Francie, her grandson Jonah saw Joji Rabbit when he was 9 and thought it was amazing. Francie says, I believe this is a little young. He didn't think so.
I think it depends on the child. I really do. I mean, that movie's got a couple of things in it. There's like a public hanging that was fairly shocking. But I think some kids are ready to start learning about this and start reading those books. I think it requires discussion on the part of the adults that are with them. They can't just sit and go through it because it's too much, and it'll bubble up in some other way and manifest, I think, if it's not processed properly. But I think that 9 is okay.
We sometimes forget what kids are exposed to at a very young age today. The entire ugliness of slavery and Reconstruction is available daily and, in a sense, kind of competes for their attention. And I wonder whether you find any of the students feel overwhelmed with the emotional pain of learning how horrible people can be.
You know that it's interesting. We don't have that many opportunities at Machon Maikada to have that kind of a discussion with them. But just this week, you may have heard, some of you may be involved with the Sukkot Shalom Committee. We are undertaking a backpack drive that's going to culminate this coming week. The entire Machon has been collecting, or we've asked people to make these brand new filled backpacks for Afghani refugee children. And so we've done some lessons around that, and we've had some really interesting and thoughtful and deep comments from the kids. So I think they do think about these things, and they are, I mean, Temple Micah kids are very aware. They're very sophisticated little kids. You know, they're not your average kids.
I think we're going to all want to get into the small groups and have a discussion that you hope would happen. But let me just conclude with this note from Barbara Green. It says her friend Frank considers himself a witness, not a survivor because he wasn't in the camps, but he lived under the Nazis until 1938 when he came to the States with his parents. He will be interviewed at the Holocaust Museum next Wednesday on his experiences. And let me just, there's a late message here from Ruth Cummings. Generations After DC is a group of mostly 2Gs, child survivors and a few survivors. We provide programming in person, not now, and Zoom. We just presented last Sunday a program on Kristallnacht.
Thank you for that. I would just like to address the comment about Frank, because this has been a long time discussion in the Holocaust community. I would say there's something among the people who lived through the Holocaust. It's called the hierarchy of suffering, that says that only the people who lived in the camps, who went through the camps and the ghettos, are actual survivors. And I would say that that's absolutely not true. So many families were devastated by the initial years of the Nazi rise to power, both in Germany, you know, Central European countries, as well as East European countries. I mean, the East European maybe a few years later, but even if you did not go through a concentration camp, a work camp, or a death camp, even if your family had to go to Siberia and wait the war out, you're a survivor. My goodness, it's, you know, I reject that notion that just because you didn't go through it, you're not a survivor. So, anyway.
Well, thank you, Sid, for being our expert moderator for our question and answer. And thank you again, Sharon. And before we break out into our breakout groups, I want to thank Karen, David, Francie, Sid, Jerry, Barbara, and our whole Lunch and Learn committee for their faithful work, which keeps this program flourishing. Thanks to the whole Temple Micah office staff, particularly Janelle Dissa, Sarah Brown, and Beth Warland. Now we're ready to have our technical genius, David, divide us into the breakout rooms. A few reminders: if you turned off your video, turn it back on now, switch to gallery view, unmute your audio, and if you need any help in the breakout rooms, click on the question mark and David will join you. So get ready to chat with old and new friends. Thank you, David.